Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sam Mansfield and I'm your chairman for this evening. We're pleased to have along with us this evening John, also called Mansfield, who's going to talk to us on the subject of the Bible's significance of events in Ukraine and Russia. So we're really looking forward to what John's got to say. A couple of housekeeping things. If you haven't been here before, the toilets are outside and to the rear of the hall, so if you need them. But we're going to open with a prayer before we ask John to come forward and speak to us. So if you'll rise, we'll offer a prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. We thank you for opportunities we have like tonight to open up your word, to understand a little bit more from it. We know that there are many people suffering around the world, people suffering from war, not just in the Ukraine but in many places. We know that there are people suffering from natural disasters, from floods, and people suffering from pandemics. We pray that you'll be with all of them. We pray that you'll bring your kingdom soon, that it might be established on this earth and all this suffering will be removed. We ask that you'll be with us tonight as well. Help us to open our hearts and our minds as we learn more about you and your purpose with this earth. And we offer this prayer through your Son's name, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So I'll hand it over to John, who's going to speak to the subject of Bible's significance of events in Ukraine and Russia. Thanks, John.
That major escalation from Russia over Ukraine, the U.S. bracing tonight for what could come next.
The message is very clear. Should Russia take further aggressive actions against Ukraine, the costs will be severe and the consequences serious.
A dangerous escalation in the Ukraine crisis. Russian President Vladimir Putin formally recognizing two pro-Russian rebel areas in the east of the country as independent, ordering his military to move across the border under the guise of peacekeeping.
Ukraine's ambassador blasting Russia's representative.
The Russian president declared the war on the record. Should I play the video of your president? There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell.
It's a sudden and alarming escalation.
Ukraine is not just a neighbouring country. It's an integral part of our history, culture, spiritual continuum.
Putin is using justifications like peacekeeping, which no one outside of Russia will believe, but the Russian people will believe because Mr. Putin controls what they see and hear.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered what he's calling peacekeeping operations,
declaring he will recognise the independence of two regions in Ukraine.
And no one was going to stand up against him. I mean, his intelligence chief was stammering.
As Ukrainian government leaders say the Russian invasion has begun. And just a few minutes ago, for the second time this hour, we have heard air raid sirens, loud sirens, here in Lviv. This is in the west of the country.
After weeks of warnings, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has begun.
As we go to air, Ukraine is in a fight for survival. Russian troops closing in on the nation's capital.
But this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine. Russian tanks rolling across the border from Belarus in the north and Crimea in the south. But they're being pushed to the limit by Russia's full-scale invasion with attacks across Ukraine.
One senior Pentagon official told ABC's Martha Raddatz, quote, "You are likely in the last few hours of peace on the European continent for a long time to come. Be careful."
A very sobering message, but captures exactly what we are facing here in Ukraine, on the European continent. The most dangerous time, as they've said over and over at the Pentagon, since World War II.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. The Christadelphians that meet in this place welcome you to this public address, and also welcome to all those that join us online this evening or at any time in the future. Well, we certainly live in dramatic and uncertain times, don't we? There's no question of that. We may have just seen another example of an event that will shape the course of our world. 14th of July, 1789, the start of the French Revolution and the change of Europe. 1st of September 1939, the start of World War II as Hitler invades Poland. 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the 11th of September 2001, the fall of the Twin Towers and the start of the War on Terror. Will the 24th of February 2022 join that list of significant dates to be remembered for many decades to come, that future generations of schoolchildren will be called to memorise? Russian troops marching across an international border, closing in on a European capital, families sheltering in underground stations, children and wives being sent away while the fathers and husbands stay to fight. An actual invasion of a European country by another. One commentator put it this way: footage of such events looks strange in colour. It should only be seen in grainy black and white. Europe was meant to have left behind events like this in the 1940s, but history is back, confronting us with a choice that we imagined we'd made long ago. Putin believes that he has the right to redraw the map of Europe and to do so in blood. They're startling words to describe the situation that we see before our eyes today. But what we want to look at tonight is what these events mean. We're seeing dramatic and fearful times. People are certainly unsure. Even here in Australia, they're questioning what is going on in the world. But tonight we want to take a step back. We want to understand that there is a greater hope and a greater future beyond the events that we see. These events are chaotic and they are distressing, but they're not the end. And tonight we'll see that there is a better time coming. Nights like this can be difficult in finding a balance. Of course, we have a keen interest in understanding the events of this world and how they align to biblical prophecies. But that interest is heavily matched with a sadness as we see and hear of the horrors of war. Tonight we'll come to understand that God has laid out the events of man before his Son's return. Of course, we don't celebrate the loss of life or the terror and sadness that comes from war. But we're excited because they are signs to us of his Son's return. And it's what his Son's return means that excites us. Because Jesus' return will bring a time of peace, a time of blessing, a time of security, the likes of which this world has never seen. Whether it be 2 years, 10 years, or many decades, the events that we see in the world today give us confidence in our faith, and above all demonstrate that the power of man has no way to solve these problems. The interactions and the conflicts of men can only lead to pain and grief. And it's only the true King of Peace, Jesus Christ, that we all look to, and that is why we consider these events tonight. Jesus said to his disciples shortly before he left our world, "You will hear wars and rumours of wars, but see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." Jesus gave these words as guidance for disciples of all ages of what to expect right before his return. Jesus knew well the words of earlier prophecies like Daniel and Ezekiel, speaking of an invasion of Israel by a king of the north, an army led by Gog of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal. Students of prophecy have long believed that this was a way of identifying Russia, the only major power in the uttermost parts of the north, as the prophet Ezekiel described it. So it's not at all surprising to us as readers of the Bible that Russia is building up its empire in Ukraine, demonstrating its desire to expand its power and control and influence over the world. Russia has already taken a significant presence in the Middle East through the war in Syria, and the vast gas resources in Israel might well be a prize for the future. And as it extends its stranglehold over European gas supplies in Ukraine, we see it continuing to build its empire. The events we're seeing right now may well indicate that Jesus could be here tomorrow, but he could also still be decades away. Now is not the time for bold predictions or confident crystal ball gazing. Instead, these events give us quiet confidence. They demonstrate that faith can be real and that we should continue to live out our faith in the way that Jesus taught, to look out for the needs of others, to encourage each other, and to love in the way that he demonstrated to us. Bible prophecy is undoubtedly one of the ways we see God's active role in our world today. The war in Syria, Russia in the Middle East, the changing role of the US, Brexit, and now the war in Ukraine, the changing face of Europe. These events do not occur by accident, as they play out in direct alignment with what is laid out for us in the Bible's prophetic word. Throughout the scriptural narrative, we see time and time again references to Russia, and it gives us confidence that God is powerful and that he's active in our world today. So what we want to do tonight, as I said before, is to take a step back, to look at where we are now and how we got here. The events in the last month in Ukraine have not happened in isolation. They are part of a wider series of events down through history. And so what we want to do is take a step through those events and understand the context and the information that they give us today, so that we understand how we arrived where we are with Russia invading Ukraine. And so to do that, we first want to go back to medieval times, to the fall of the Roman Empire and the birth of the Russian Empire. The year is 1453, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, are taking over the then known world. The final stand of the previous world empire, the Roman Empire, comes to an end with the fall of the city of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Rome having already fallen earlier. Now, for those that are taking notes, you'll see on the bottom left of the screen there, it's got Revelation 9, verse 14 to 21, and that is the prophetic record that covers these events. We're not going to go into it tonight, but for your reference, that is the reference. What springs out of this destruction by the Turks of Constantinople and the fall of the Roman Empire is the Roman religion. The Roman Catholic religion looks for a new place to call its home. And Ivan III, the current leader in Russia, stands up and offers an opportunity for the home of the Roman religion to move to Russia, and specifically to the city of Moscow. And by doing this, Ivan III becomes the first Tsar of Russia, and he's given a new title. The title is the new Tsar of Constantine, of the new city of Constantine, which is now Moscow. One monk, when writing about this, put it this way. He's speaking to Ivan III. He said, "So know, pious king, that all the Christian kingdoms came to an end and came together in a single kingdom of yours. 2 Romes have fallen," and he's speaking about the literal city of Rome and then the spiritual city of Rome in Constantinople that we've been talking about. So 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and that's Moscow, and there will be no fourth. So we see here that at the fall of the Roman Empire, we have the birth of another empire. Sure, the Ottoman Empire is taking over the then known world, but we have the birth of this new Russian Empire. Tsar Ivan III being the first Tsar, and then following on from him, Ivan the Terrible establishes the Russian Empire in 1502. And there's this deep link at the start of the Russian Empire to the Roman religion. That's all we'll speak about for now in terms of the Roman religion, but keep that in mind as we come to the end looking through this narrative. What we're going to do now is jump over about 500 years of history. The various machinations of the Russian Empire bear little relevance to what we see today in Ukraine. So we're going to jump forward to the 1900s and to the Russian Revolution. The year is 1917. Tsar Nicholas II is on the throne, and as you can probably guess from there being a revolution, he was the last Tsar or emperor of the Russian Empire. And instead, the empire is taken over by a new movement, the movement of communism, where the Bolshevik Party led by Vladimir Lenin becomes the new form or the new version of the Russian Empire, and it's referred to as the Soviet Union, led, as I said, by Premier Vladimir Lenin. So this is the end of the Russian Empire, and at this point, the territory controlled by that empire is transformed, and it becomes the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, as you've probably heard it referred to. And so Russia's traditional monarchy is replaced with the world's first communist state. What we're doing as we step through this is we're looking through the history of this area of Europe, the history of Russia, to try and provide a context and a background to understand what's going on in Ukraine today. What we'll see is the events that we're looking at that have occurred as key moments in Russian history will have a direct impact on what we see today. So we'll spend a little more time spelling out this history, and then we'll bring it all together in understanding what's going on in Ukraine. So the USSR now occupies the territory of what was the Russian Empire. You can see that map on the screen overlaid with the modern countries of Europe. That is the territory of what's now the USSR, previously the Russian Empire. It goes up south into Kazakhstan and in the east, then it extends northwest into Europe with countries like Latvia and Lithuania in the Baltics. There's Belarus, there's Ukraine, and then down into Asia through the Caucasus region, into Georgia and Azerbaijan. And so now, as we head further into the 1900s, Joseph Stalin is the leader of this territory, leader of the Soviet Union, and it continues on. Stalin continues to rule the empire, and we arrive and find ourselves in the early 1930s. The USSR is now well established. They've left behind the turbulent times of the revolution. But further west in Europe, change is now afoot. Struggling with the burden of reparation payments for World War I and the impact of the Great Depression, Germany becomes the perfect breeding ground for a new tyrant, which culminates in August 1934. On 2nd of August 1934, Hitler self-appoints himself, naturally, if he self-appoints, himself as the Führer of Germany. So he's now the leader or the emperor of the German country. He goes on from this self-appointment to conduct a series of military campaigns. What he's doing is he's testing the world's appetite, their attitude, and what their response will be to these small military acts as he has further ambitions down the line. So first of all, Austria is annexed by Germany. Then Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia, is annexed by Germany. And then we have Chamberlain, who was the United Kingdom Prime Minister at the time, goes across and has a meeting with Putin. Now, this was the point in time. The war has not yet started. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a war coming from history. The war has not yet started. This was the time for the UK or France or others to step in and make a stop to prevent the need for more war. There'd already been various military interactions in Czechoslovakia and Austria. But instead of doing something significant to blunt Hitler's momentum, they used merely words and sanctions and financial threats, and they did nothing. We've seen exactly the same today with Putin and Ukraine. And it wasn't enough back then with Hitler, and it's been demonstrated today it's not enough now to stop the movements of Putin. Sorry, I did intend to put up. There's a picture of the man himself, Chamberlain, where he came back and said there will be peace in Europe on the back of his discussions with Hitler around the threat of sanctions. But as we found out, that led to nothing. So following on from that, we have the events of Crystal Night, the Night of Broken Glass, where anti-Semitism sees a sharp uprising in Germany. And then finally, we have this final pinnacle event before the Second World War begins. And Hitler demands the return of a little region or city called Danzig, which was a part of Poland in the north. And the reason Hitler demanded the return of that portion is because he said it was part of the natural home of Germany. There was German people there, even though it was in Poland. He said it was a natural part of Germany and it should be returned. But on the basis of this and the city not being returned, Europe was plunged into war. And we have Hitler invading Poland. Now, the trigger for this was a very interesting incident which involved that city of that region of Danzig that I spoke about, and it's referred to as a false flag incident. You can see it on the top right of the screen. And what a false flag incident is where the Germans themselves created the incident and then subsequently used that incident as the excuse to invade Poland. So there was a gentleman part of the Nazi SS. His name was Alfred Nujoks. And in 31st August 1939, he facilitated an attack on a radio station in Poland. But what he did is made the attack look like the Poles themselves had attacked that German radio station. So he was a German, He did the attack, he killed some Germans in the process, but he set it up to look like the Polish people had come in and attacked this German radio station in Poland. And that was the perfect excuse Hitler needed to invade. He made out to the world the Poles are attacking Germans. He called it an incident that needed their response, a false flag incident in the end. And the German troops, the Nazis, march into Poland, and so that's where we have the start of the Second World War. Look at Hitler's commentary on that region of Poland. Danzig was and is a German city. The corridor was and is German, even though that was a city within Poland. But he's making the argument the reason for their invasion was there was a German city, regardless of whether or not it was in Germany, it was in fact in Poland. That city with Germans in it was under threat, and that was the only excuse he needed to invade. Now, the process of creating an excuse for war, setting up a reason for invasion through deception, is also something that's used by the Russian military or the Russian army, and it's enshrined in their military doctrine. It's referred to as Russian maskarova, and the word maskarova is just the Russian word for deception. Oh, I'll quickly fix that. Got a little insight into my slides that still need editing process, but it got finished editing, have no fear. Oh no, it's even worse. Should have left the pink there. There we go. I don't know what I did, but there we go. So what was I saying? Russian maskarova. Let me read you the quote on the screen. A military doctrine developed from the start of the 20th century. The doctrine covers a broad range of measures for military deception, from camouflage to denial and deception. And this practice, this military doctrine of maskarova was practiced time and time again by the Russians in World War II. Here's a couple of examples. They left cutouts of fake tanks lying around to deceive their enemy. They had fake military bases set up to disguise their military position. They had all of these different measures to try and deceive their enemy, and that continues to be employed today. But what's interesting is Daniel, who's an ancient biblical prophet, as part of his prophecy, speaking about the latter days and speaking about the role of Russia, he says this particular phrase. He says, "By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand." So from what the Bible's telling us, we expect this king of the north that's described through the Bible, this Russian army, to come in, but not just to come in with might, but also to do it through deceit and deception. And we've seen it in World War II, we've laid it out now, we're going to see it time and time again as we track the expansion and the movement of the Russian Empire. And so we travel through time, and the end of World War II comes, and at the close of World War II, the world enters a new history of war. It's the Cold War era, with two great superpowers and their allied nations being set up against each other. On the west side, or the Allied side, we have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and you can see US President John F. Kennedy there on the screen, President of the US at the time. And on the other side, Eastern Europe, Russia, the Russian Empire, the USSR that we've already spoken of, led by their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Just going to take another drink, sorry. So the Cold War era that sprung up following World War II was this next theatre of conflict for the Russians. And although there was no direct engagement with the Americans and their allies, it's still a period that's categorised by fear and tension, and this lasted right up until 1990. Now, what's interesting about this period of time is this is the context and the period of history where Putin was born and grew up in. So this period of time with Russia in this frame of tension at war with their Western allied enemies, NATO, is how Putin grew up to understand his homeland, understand how his country behaved. And so this attitude of being in conflict, trying to firmly maintain borders of Russia against the creeping influence of the West, is how Putin came to understand the world as a young man growing up in that system. And this situation with this tension and this constant back and forth between Russia and the Western powers remained until 1989, where there was a dramatic shift in the history and in the frame of that region. There was a groundswell of desire for change rushing across Europe. And that groundswell for change can be encapsulated in one of the most iconic events of that era.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The iconic phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, uttered by Ronald Reagan there. So following on from that, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall or the Iron Curtain, which triggers and leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly, while these events are playing out, there's a young KGB agent, which is KGB is the Russian intelligence agency at the time, in East Germany, witnessing these events, witnessing the collapse, the trigger of the collapse of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And his name was Vladimir Putin. You can see his KGB identification card on the screen. As a young man witnessing these events, having a deep connection back to Russia, these events would have been very formative as Putin grew up. It would have impacted how he understood the world and also his purpose in it. And so seeing these significant events in Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the question has to be asked. As young Vlad sat there in Germany and looked back and saw the collapse of his beloved homeland, seeing the wall fall down, his homeland fall apart, what impact did that have on him? What impact did it have on his political ideology? Well, look at how Putin described these events. Speaking of the collapse of the Soviet Union, he called it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. He also went on to say tens of millions of our compatriots found themselves outside of Russian territory. It's worth noting that the century that Putin's referring to includes two world wars, the Holocaust and the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. Many events that caused millions of people to lose their lives. But Putin, with full knowledge of that history and context, still calls the fall and the destruction of his homeland the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And that lens through which he views the world shapes how he behaves today and how he engages with the world and where he believes the Russian position of the world should be. And so the collapse of the Soviet Union or the USSR led to the expansion and the creep of NATO across into Eastern Europe, and even included some countries that had previously belonged to the Russian Empire, such as the Baltics, Latvia and Lithuania. And of course, that was of great concern to Russia. You can see there on the screen, the dark blue is the original territory of NATO. Light blue is the additional countries they've added, getting closer and closer to Russia after the events of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then we've also highlighted there, Ukraine in yellow, in the centre of it all, and in the darker red, the countries that Russia patrols or maintains influence over today: Belarus, Moldova, Georgia and Syria. So you can see, Ukraine is situated right there, right in the middle of this melting pot. On the one side, on the western side, the push of NATO right up against the border of Ukraine towards Russia to oppose any further growth of the Russian Empire. And on the same side, on their eastern border, Russia is holding its line, wanting to maintain its territory and recapture what was it views as its traditional empire. And then you can see on the right of the screen, simultaneous with the expansion and the movement of NATO, we have the growth and the rise of Putin. So he goes from various roles within the political system, starting off as deputy chairman, deputy chief, through the Russian security services, their intelligence organisation, into the prime ministership. And finally then, 26th of March 2000, Putin is elected as president of Russia. Let's hear from one of the world leaders of the time, George Bush, on Putin in the early days of his presidency.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
Putin was indeed a man deeply committed to his country. He was a man that was committed to the expansion of the Russian Empire, and his ideology can be summed up in the Russian phrase Ruski Mir, which means Russian world. ABC International Affairs analyst Stan Grant put it this way: there is no Ukraine without Russia. They are one. Putin himself said so. Putin sees Ukraine as Russian land, essential to his idea of Ruski Mir. It is about Russian language, culture, it is blood and soil, it is mythological. Ruski Mir is holy, central to the Russian Orthodox faith. To nationalists like Putin, George W. Bush called him a man deeply committed to his country. To nationalists like Putin, Ukraine's capital Kyiv is the mother of all Russian cities. This is why Putin famously called the Soviet Union collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Putin doesn't want communism back. He wants Russia back in control of the world. So we can see the lens through which Putin has developed his view of the world by experiencing the tension of his growing years, the collapse of his empire, by growing up through those tensions of the Cold War and understanding Russia as an empire with borders that must be firmly maintained. It shaped how he perceives world events, how he understands what he must do, how he must behave as their president or as their emperor. And so Putin himself has embarked on various steps to reclaim the Russian Empire. And this might look similar to you as the events that led up to the Second World War. So as we saw, in the year 2000, he's appointed president of Russia. And the same year, Chechnya is annexed by Russia. He then goes on to annex South Ossetia, which is a region of Georgia. In 2008, 2014, a portion of Ukraine, Crimea, is annexed by Russia. And then we have there on the screen the same as what occurred in Germany in the lead up to the Second World War. There's the typical response from the Western powers. US, UK and Europe all say no military forces will be sent to Ukraine. Just like Europe in the 1930s, the same troubles are here today. One political commentator put it this way: the United States and friends were so gung-ho about intervening in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. But look how squeamish they are when it comes to tackling Russia. They should have learned their lesson. If you dally with megalomaniacs, the price can only go up. The time to intervene decisively was 2014. But 90 years is plenty of time to forget the lessons of the lead up to World War II. Sanctions don't deter the determined. Big words don't win wars. An interesting insight: sanctions don't deter the determined. And so then we have the final event of this timeline in the lead up to the events we see today, with Putin recognising the independence of Donetsk, a region of Crimea occupied by Russians, much the same as Danzig and Hitler in World War II. And the Western powers stand back. They're unable to do anything to stop this progression. The time to do that was long ago. So can you see the parallels in the events that we see today and the lead up to the Second World War? A leader obsessed with power and the might and strength of his own country looks outside of his own borders and finds specific territories occupied by his own people. He doesn't care that they're within another country. For Hitler, it was Czechoslovakia and Poland. For Putin, it's been Georgia and Ukraine. And they say, I view that area as independent. They are my people. I need to protect them. And so just like Germany and Western Europe in the 1930s, there is the same build-up and escalation in Eastern Europe in the 2020s as we see today. This is the outworking of Putin's Russian worldview, a deep-seated desire to restore the Russian Empire to the pinnacle of the world, the controlling power of the world. Another example of this is captured in a historical essay which Putin penned in 2021. It's called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And he said this: "I am convinced that Ukraine's true sovereignty is possible only in partnership with Russia." And then he called them essentially the same historical and spiritual space. Putin views the world through this lens, he wrote out in this essay. Any nation, any country, any region that was previously part of the Russian Empire must again join that territory. Let's hear more on this from Putin.
И Крым всегда был и остается неотъемлемой частью России. Эта убежденность, основанная на правде и справедливости, была непоколебимой, передавалась из поколения в поколение. Перед ней были бессильны и время, и обстоятельства. Бессильны все драматические перемены, которые мы переживала наша страна в течение всего XX века. Россия оказалась на рубеже, от которого не могла уже отступить. Если до упора сжимать пружину, она когда-нибудь с силой разожмется. Надо помнить об этом всегда. Ведь мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ. Киев – мать городов русских. Древняя Русь – это наш общий исток. Мы все равно не сможем друг без друга. И скажу еще об одном. На Украине живут и будут жить миллионы русских людей, русскоязычных граждан. И Россия всегда будет защищать их интересы политическими, дипломатическими, правовыми средствами. Однако прежде всего...
Look at what Putin says. We are one people. That's how he views the world. You also saw he referred there to ancient Rus or Rosh as it's called, and we'll look at that more as we come to understand the biblical record on these events. So Putin's view is that any nation that belonged to his empire, they are one. They need to be back together as he seeks to re-establish the Russian might in the world. Look at how commentators are picking up on these events. One article entitled this, How Russia's World War II Military Strategy of Deception is Alive and Well Today, commenting on the alignment of the work Russia did in World War II and how it matches the deception that's playing out in Ukraine today. And one such example of this deception, US official accused Russia of being behind a car bombing in rebel-held Ukraine that Russian media is using to fan war flames. So exactly the same way that Hitler in the 30s used an attack on his own people in a German radio station in Poland to justify moving in and invading the country, Putin is using that exact same strategy of deception to set up terror events so he can demonstrate the need for peacekeeping missions in Ukraine. A couple more articles. Russia accuses the West of turning a blind eye to what it calls genocide in eastern Ukraine. Again, Russia setting up examples of what they're flagging as the need for them to go into Ukraine to save their people that are in that country. And finally, Putin orders Russian forces to Ukraine's rebel regions. And what's the reason? He says he needs to move in to protect Russian people and to maintain peace in these regions. He's creating the excuse to move into the country. And so following on from these various actions of deception in Ukraine, Putin uses this as the context to invade. So as we said at the start, the 24th of February 2022, we have the invasion of Ukraine, the largest military conflict in Europe since the Second World War. What does Putin say, speaking of Ukraine? We are not simply close neighbours, we are one people. And he raises these security concerns. He builds this narrative around the Ukrainian people creating provocations. That's the reason he needs to go in there. He needs to protect his own people, the people he views as his. And that's why he moves into Ukraine. See the parallels to World War II? See the parallels to exactly what Hitler did, creating this basis for invasion through deception and propaganda, raising fears of security concerns for Russians in foreign territories, and then simply marching across the border and seizing control. Well, that's where we are right now. So how did we get here? We've arrived at a point in history where the leader of Russia has a deeply held personal ideology about the Empire of Russia, a global Russian empire. Ruski Mir, the Russian world. So throughout the turbulence of the Cold War era and this lingering distrust of Western powers, through a love of the Russian Empire, seen partly in the USSR but truly to be restored as a global superpower, it's no wonder then that Putin wants Ukraine back in the Russian family. And for a man like Putin, it won't stop there. Almost certainly, Ukraine is just the next step in his journey of rebuilding this empire that he sees as his home. So that's where we sit today. Exactly what the future holds in the next days and weeks and months and years, we don't know. Of course, we're not going to predict every single event of this world. But our title tonight, Understanding the Biblical Significance of These Events, may give us some insight. A man by the name of John Thomas, he was a Bible student. When he picked up his Bible and read the various prophecies, he wrote these words: "When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. The long-expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact." And so we have the events where we see today. We do have Russia seeking to build up its empire. And a Bible student looking at the narrative of Bible prophecy says, when you see those events, that is a sign that Jesus is coming back. We're going to stop now briefly and look at one of those prophecies so that we understand what this Bible student is referring to. When they say Russia's grand move, what are they talking about? So if you've got a Bible with you, or even if you've got a Google on your phone, feel free to come across to Ezekiel 38 or type that into Google. I'm sure it will pop up for you. So this is a chapter in the whole prophecy of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a prophet that lived in the BC era, which means he lived before Christ. And he was given various prophecies by God around what events would transpire in the world just before the return of God's Son, Jesus Christ. So we're looking at Ezekiel 38, and I'm just going to quickly flick through a couple of verses and read them for you out loud. We'll start from verse 1. It says, and this is Ezekiel speaking, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal." So we're going to stop there. So those names or words may sound unusual: Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, Gog and Magog. Very ancient language, but they describe modern eras of our world today. The word Gog is just a name, so it's given to the leader of this army. We don't know who that is. It will be whoever stands up as the leader of this army. But we're told that the army comes out of key areas. He's the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and it's also the land of Magog. So we're going to look at this area of Rosh that's described in verse 2 and verse 3 and see what scholars down through history looking at this word Rosh have interpreted it to mean, and you can see it now on the screen. Now, Rosh is a Hebrew word. As you probably know from ancient languages, they can have multiple meanings. So in some contexts, it just means head or chief, but in other areas, it refers to a specific geographical location, and that's what it's referring to here. In Greek, the word is Rus, R-U-S, and that is exactly the same word that Putin used in his speech when he was describing the territory of Russia. So I think that's already a clue on what this Rosh in Ezekiel 38 is referring to. Now, a few more commentators on what they mean. Gesenius, in a Hebrew Chaldee dictionary, said that Rosh was undoubtedly the Russians. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes the territories of Rosh as distributed among Belarus, northern Ukraine, eastern Poland, and the European section of Russia. That's the ancient empire of Russia. A book called Sacred Geography says Rosh is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of Russia. And in a book about Ivan III, referred to as called Reign of Terror, it says the word Russia replaced the old name Rus or Rosh. So I hope from that brief summary, and we can spend more time speaking about it afterwards if you want more details, but from that brief overview of different scholars, you can see that the Rosh spoken about by the prophet Ezekiel thousands of years ago is the nation of Russia. What I'm going to do is now bring up this map, because Ezekiel 38 as a prophecy goes through these various names: Magog, Meshech and Tubal, Persia, etc. And they're all names that we wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, but what we've done is map them out on a map to show you where they are in our world today. So we have Magog, which is the area of Germany and Poland. We have Meshech and Tubal, which is the cities of Moscow and Tobolsk in modern-day Russia. We have Persia, which is the area of Iraq and Iran. We have Libya, which is a country we're familiar with today in northern Africa, and the same with Ethiopia. Excuse me, sorry. And then we have Goma, which is the countries of France and Belgium, and Tagama, which is Turkey. So through this prophecy in Ezekiel, it describes this army made up of all these different territories across Europe and northern Africa and parts of Asia. And they come down. So let's see what this army does. It says in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, "After many days you will be visited in the latter years, and you will come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but is brought forth out of these nations, and you shall dwell safely, all of them." So Ezekiel's prophecy describes that this army, led by the Russians but made up of all these other European countries, comes down against the mountains of Israel. And now, very briefly, we're going to talk about who opposes them, and then we're going to move on. But if you want to look at this in more detail later, more than happy to step you through what all of these things mean. So finally then, in verse 13, it describes who will be the opposition to this army that comes down led by the Russians. Verse 13 says, "Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions will say to you, are you come to take a spoil? Have you gathered your company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold?" So the opposition to this army, led by Russia, made up of these nations of Europe, it says it's opposed by Tarshish, by the young lions, by Sheba, and by Dedan. And again, they're ancient names, but Tarshish is a reference to the United Kingdom. The young lions, therefore, are all the Commonwealth nations that were set up by the United Kingdom. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, etc. You get the idea. And then Sheba and Dedan, you can see there on the map in blue. It's the Saudi area and the Gulf states down in the south of that peninsula. So we have what the Bible lays out as a prophecy for the end times before Jesus returns. We have this army led by Russia, made up of European nations. They come down right before Jesus returns out of the north, naturally where Russia comes from, and they come against the mountains of Israel. And so let's continue the quote that we saw earlier by this Bible student. He goes on further. He says, "The Russian autocracy," which means the Russian Empire, "in its plenitude, abundance," this was written a couple of hundred years ago in England, so they liked fancy words, but the Russian Empire in its abundance, on the verge of dissolution, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing upon the mountains of Israel, ready to be smitten by the stone. And so now we have another Bible prophecy. It's in Daniel chapter 2, and it's referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's image. You can see an image on the screen. Daniel, similarly to Nebuchadnezzar, was a prophet that lived before Jesus Christ. He lived in Babylon. He was carried away there by the Babylonian Empire. And while he was there, he was used to interpret various dreams that were given either to him or to the king of Babylon. This particular one was given to the king of Babylon. And it describes this great image with a head of gold, arms of silver, a belly of brass, legs of iron, and then feet made up of part of iron and part of clay. And what did that Bible student say? It said, when we get to the end, when we are just before Jesus returns, Russia, leading this army, is this image, the feet of this image, standing on the mountains of Israel. And there you can see what the prophecy referred to. It lays out each of the great empires of the world. The gold was the Babylonians, the silver was the Medes and the Persians, the brass was the Greeks, the iron was the Romans, and then finally we arrive at this last empire that's present in the earth right before Jesus comes back. Now I want to remind you of something we considered right back at the start. When we looked at the birth of the Russian Empire, where it came from in the 1400s, we saw that it was born out of the next phase of the Roman religion. So the Roman Empire collapsed, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and it looked for a new home. And the new home that the Roman religion found was in Moscow, in the Empire of Russia. The Third Rome, as the monk put it. What's fascinating about this is when you see that the empire of the feet that will be there in the last days just before Jesus returns, it's got iron within the feet. It's got this Roman element to this empire. The quote again from the Bible student, the Russian Empire is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing on the mountains of Israel. So right from the birth of the Russian Empire, where it sprung out of the falling away of this Roman religion, Moscow, the capital of Russia, became the Third Rome, the home place of this Roman religion. There's this deep connection. And that's why in this prophecy by Daniel, in the image, there's this Roman element to the empire that's there right at the end before Jesus returns. And so that's exactly what it means when there's this Roman basis to the Russian Empire that's seen in the iron combined with the clay. Now, iron and clay, if you've ever tried to combine them, they don't mix well together. So it's not a happy alliance, but they are together nonetheless. And it's this image, this empire that comes against the mountains of Israel. And look at the Russian military positions today. There you can see Russia in dark red. They're in Ukraine, they're in Georgia, and they're in Syria. And you can see there Syria is right there connected to the land of Israel. That border that Syria holds with Israel is connected right to the mountains of Israel. Here's a couple of maps just to further demonstrate the point. You can see the map on the right, all the different blue and red pins outlines the position of Russia within Syria. And down right at the bottom of the map, down in the south, you can see this large collection of Russia's military installations. That is right on the border of Israel, right next to the mountains of Israel. And there's an article from the Jerusalem Post speaking about Russia's concern about Israel's position in the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are the mountains of Israel. They're the mountain range that run right from the top of Israel down, right on that border with Syria. So there we have Russia right on the border, approaching the mountains of Israel, ready to step in. We are truly living in remarkable times. And that's where we see ourselves today. We have the prophecy in Ezekiel talking about Russia leading this army. We have the prophecy in Daniel talking about Russia being a key part of this image, standing on the mountains of Israel, ready to move into Israel as Ezekiel describes. That's where we find ourselves today. There's this quote, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." The escalation from Chechnya to Georgia to Crimea to Ukraine, Putin continuing to step his empire forward. Anyone who thinks it suddenly ends there, that no further escalation will occur, has failed to learn from the mistakes of the past. September 1, 1939 was when Hitler invaded Poland. And exactly 3 years and 1 month to the day later, this is what Europe looked like. The invasion of Poland to this map in just 3 years. It's not a long time. Think back to February 2019. That's how long we're talking about. And the invasion of Ukraine could mean exactly the same. What this map demonstrates to us is that it does not take long for a determined superpower to move and take over Europe. We spoke before when we were looking at Nebuchadnezzar's image that Russia and Europe are together, but it's not a strong bond. And the movement into Ukraine gives Russia further opportunity to exert control and power and influence over Europe. Russia already has control of vast gas reserves used by Europe. And if it were to establish a position in Ukraine, it only increases its monopoly control over European energy. And it's not gas like for industry and functions that people are concerned about, although that is an impact. In Europe, gas is used for all the basic functions of human life. For electricity, for the heating and cooling of their homes, of their water, for cooking. All of the basic functions of the European continent and their society could now become under Russian control. We don't know exactly what that means, but could this be the means that Russia uses to bring Europe under her empire? It's not a close alliance. It could be forced together through Russian control. And that's the position Russia could be as it moves into Ukraine. One commentator commented this: "We're appalled by Putin now, but to be clear, the West gave him the green light." And that's what it's speaking about, Russia moving into Ukraine. All that the other Western nations did is simply slipped into the background as Russia continues to take a preeminent role, restoring its empire and taking its place as what it believes it should be, the world superpower. Listen to how one poor person in Ukraine put it.
Right now, I'm at subway at one of the central. Right now, I'm at subway at one of the central station in Kiev, trying to not worrying about my life, trying to be more safe here. Because yesterday I woke up from the noise of explosions and saw flashlights, and it's scary, and I feel very, very, very angry because it's not normal situation. It's my country, it's my land, and it's my city, and now all of us, all of Ukrainians are under attack. Multiple cities are under attack.
And Ksenia, have you taken food down with you? Have you taken bedding down with you? Are you expecting to stay there for some time?
Yeah, I'm expecting to stay in there for some time and taking my sleeping bags and travel equipment. But it's still not okay. And for all the people in Great Britain and for all the people in the world, I just want to say we are here now and we are strong. We believe in our country and believe in our army. But whether we're strong or not, we need your support. We need your support now, and all these sanctions, it's good, but it's not enough. Because this war, it's not about only Ukraine and our independence and our safety. We are like a shield for you, Europe, and for the world.
We are like a shield for Europe and for the world. That's the position Ukraine faces itself today. This last decade, we've seen incredible events with Russia expanding her influence. Look at what we've seen: Russia pushing into Ukraine, looking to extend her empire. The USA drawing back, UK distancing themselves from Europe through Brexit, and Russia extending her reach, becoming the key player in the Middle East, and now moving into Europe and Northern Africa. And Israel is caught in the middle of it all. We are standing on the precipice, and all it will take is Russia to flick the switch, and the entire course of history will change. We should be asking ourselves, what is coming next? Have we already had our World War moment where our world has been sent down an inevitable path towards war? Look at the headlines we're seeing right now. Listen to the news. Look around you. See the current events. There's all this noise, all this commotion. God is shaking the nations, preparing them for his Son. And look how Jesus put it himself. Now, when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. The events in Ukraine and Russia, absolutely they bring fear. You heard it in that woman's voice as she spoke to the reporter, hunkered down in an underground part of Ukraine. But that fear is not the end. The time we see now in the world only points to a better future and a hope that's coming. The Bible speaks about that time like this. It says, when Jesus comes back, this is what he'll do. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. That is the hope we're looking forward to. We consider tonight's events to understand our world. We look at war as horrific as it is, because it speaks to us instead of a future of hope. Men can never solve their problems. They will only continue to cause conflict and chaos. But we know that there is a sure hope. It's what our faith is based upon. A hope of a coming time where Jesus is with us. There will be no more sorrow, no more tears, no more war, no more pain. A time of peace, a time of security, and a time of safety. We've seen tonight the rise of a new kind of Russian Empire. Putin looking to set his place in history as the new Tsar of the Russian Empire, becoming the new world superpower. A leader focused on creating the Russian world. Talk of world war seems a lot more real now, a lot closer, a lot more frightening. But that means that we're also a lot closer to our hope, a lot closer to an eternity of peace, and a lot closer to the moment where our King returns. We'll finish with this quote. A little more waiting for God, a little more patience, a little more endurance of evil, and continuance in well-doing. And the hour will arrive, the moment will be here, when we shall suddenly be confronted by the great fact that the Lord is in the earth. Great will be the joy of saints at the announcement, though they mingle trembling with their fear. The fear and the terror that we see in the world today, that's natural. It's undeniable. It is the natural response to war and chaos. But it should not be our only response. That fear should be matched with hope and joy and looking towards the future, because the days we face now will pass and Jesus is certainly coming back. Whether it be tomorrow, whether it be next year, whether it still be another decade, the events that we see in the world today gives us confidence that Bible prophecy accurately lays out the events we see in the world. The events we see in Europe, in Russia and the Ukraine have significance for us as Bible believers. And soon that moment will be here when the Lord is in the earth and our world will be changed forever.
Thanks for that, John. On behalf of everyone here, we really appreciate your enthusiasm for the subject and that sort of balance between the appalling events that are taking place in Ukraine with the excitement that we have for seeing Bible prophecy fulfilled at the same time. John's available for questions afterwards. He said so during the lecture, so feel free to quiz him on anything and everything. We are going to close with prayer, so if you'll rise again, we'll do that. Our Father in heaven, we again approach you with thankful hearts, thankful for this time that you've allowed us, thankful for your word, thankful for that more sure word of prophecy. And we thank you that we have some understanding about the events that we see in the world. We thank you that we don't need to fear them in the ultimate sense, but we can lift up our heads and look for our redemption coming near. So we ask that you bring your kingdom, that it might smash the kingdoms of this world and replace them and fill the whole earth with a kingdom of peace and of justice. And we ask for that time to come through our coming King, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.